The atmosphere, the party, the music, everything is just the best.
Wickedest time ever.
I'm kid dancing forever, me. Well, at least till I remember where I put my car.
90s rave culture was a phenomenon that swept across the world, breaking down social barriers, bringing people together.
You run up and hug people just because that's what you want to do. You're smiling at people.
But you know, not everyone saw it quite like that.
It's a 90s phenomenon which looks set to stay. According to police, each party is a disaster waiting to happen.
Some newspapers have called acid house music a sinister and evil cult which lures young people into drug taking.
When police moved in to break up the party at 5 this morning, the youngsters pelted them with missiles. But officers in riot gear broke through the barricades and into the building where they seized £1,000 worth of drugs.
Today we will explore this incredibly controversial subculture that changed the world.
It's one of the biggest hypes that have come on the music scene in recent years. And it's the peripheral stories that go with it. Drugs, sex, sensation.
Rave culture really took over in the 90s. It was a phenomenon in Britain, and it was so different to what culture was doing prior. So for us to work out why this happened, we need to go back to Chicago in the 80s. Basically, a bunch of gay black dudes were having a good old time boogieing to this genre of music called disco. But there was a major problem, and that was that disco was becoming uncool. When I say uncool, I mean there was literally a riot in 1979 to protest disco music.
Between games, as planned, a huge box containing thousands of disco records was blown up. The rest was unplanned. Fans stormed out onto the field in the thousands. Disco records were hurled like frisbees. Bonfires were set. Bottles were thrown.
In a panic that disco might die, Frankie Knuckles went into the lab and started to remix these disco tracks. And he started to take this sound and play it in a place called the Warehouse.
So-called house music was first made in the creators' houses, but it was also performed at clubs called the Warehouse and Powerhouse.
Americans didn't really get house in the beginning. There was no cool guitar dude with neon leggings and big hair to look at and admire. It was just a bro with headphones looking at the decks. And so as house music entered his puberty, he packed his bags and got on a flight to a small little island.
This is a resort that has made too many headlines for the wrong reasons in recent years, often because of the behaviour of some British tourists.
There were 4 lads, somewhere in the late 80s, who went on a squaddy to Ibiza. Paul Oakenfold, Danny Ramplin, Nicky Holloway, and Johnny Walker. These boys would be known as the Ibiza 4. Like most Brits in this era, they went there for a good time. They went to Ibiza to party, and they went to one club called Amnesia. But it would be in this club where they would discover this smooth daddy DJ called Alfredo. Alfredo was this omnipotent DJ. People would fawn over him. He was this god on the island. But part of his appeal was he was playing this new sound of music, came from Chicago and Detroit, which we now know was house. Alfredo was getting these records from members of the Paradise Group, which included people like Frankie Knuckles and Larry Levan, which were all early house DJs. The Ibiza 4 returned home looking like they'd directly communicated with God and immediately came back and set up their own clubs to try and recreate this Ibiza vibe. But you see, it wasn't just the good weather, the cool vibes and the sun that was making this so special. There was something else that tied this whole thing together. Just a quick warning, drug talk is coming. Don't do drugs. Okay, let's move on. MDMA was patented all the way back in 1913, but it was a pharmaceutical medicine and it didn't really get used. It was just shelved. There was a few experiments in the 50s where the American government was trying to control people's minds and they gave it to soldiers, but then it wouldn't be until the 70s where it would land in the hands of therapists. And then it instantly spread all around the world. And it would be in Ibiza where British people would really come across MDMA. Supposedly, MDMA arrived in Ibiza from America due to a cult. The cult was extradited from America. I might make a video on this. And they were quite big fans of MDMA and they ended up setting up distribution networks in Ibiza. But for us to really understand why ecstasy was so important, kind of need to get a feel for what Britain was like in the 80s. Boys, I have this problem when I'm making these videos. It happens very often where I'll find a documentary that has all the information I need to learn. And then I go to try and watch it on a streaming service and it's like geo-locked. I can't get it because I'm from England. And so today's sponsor, CyberGhost VPN, is the perfect solution for this problem and many others. It's the best way to stay safe online against hackers and as well malicious websites. With CyberGhost VPN, all of your traffic goes through a secure VPN tunnel. Your IP address is completely hidden and your data is completely encrypted. Ghost VPN is available on all platforms: Windows, Mac OS, Android, iOS, and many others. And they have a strict no logs policy, so no one can ever see your activity online. Not even CyberGhost themselves can. As well, one subscription will secure 7 devices, which you can just share with your friends and families on one subscription. And there's no risk. There's a 45-day money-back guarantee, 24/7 customer support, so everything is risk-free. CyberGhost VPN have been very kind and given me their best deal ever to offer to you guys, which is just $2.03 a month, plus 4 months completely free. So that's 84% off. CyberGhost VPN has more than 38 million users, and you can check their rating out on Trustpilot. They have an excellent score. And so make sure you check the pinned comment to get this offer that's only available for you guys. The link's also available in the description, so you can start protecting yourself today. Anyway, back to the video. Margaret Thatcher was the original bad bitch. Before Margaret Thatcher, Britain was, all holding each other's hands, singing, "We're all in this together," dancing on school lunch tables. And it was really nice, but there was a problem, and that was we were broke. In 1979, the Iron Lady came in to fix all of Britain's problems. She brought in a number of policies that focused on privatisation of industries. And this had ripple effects into British culture. The Thatcher times were kind of defined as very individualist.
It's more socially acceptable to say, I want money, I want a house, I want a car, to be greedy.
And this attitude did work for a bit, and you could talk endlessly about the pros and the cons of Thatcherism. However, towards the end of her time in office, the UK was once again in deep economic trouble, particularly affecting the poorer working classes. There was high social inequality and mass unemployment. And when you couple that with the fact that at the time there was very high racial and social tensions, and you had loads of young unemployed people with fuck all to do, the mid to late 80s just was a mess. But then, far away at the end of the tunnel, there was a silver light, or more so, a neon laser. In 1987, as the Ibiza 4 returned from their pilgrimage, they came back to England to spread the good news of house music and ecstasy. They all set up their own clubs around England, firstly playing Chicago house and Balearic beats. But slowly the house music started to evolve. It started to get darker and heavier.
What do you know about acid house music?
There's meant to be a drugs-related craze.
And where did you find that out?
That was in the paper.
Just read about it in the newspapers that acid house music, I assumed it was something to do with the drug scene.
All them lights flashing don't do you any good either, do it?
It became very popular very quickly, but there was a problem, and that was that the venues that the parties happened at, they couldn't keep the numbers. You could only squeeze so many bodies into this sardine tin until it popped. On top of that, the clubs would have to close at like 2 or 3. And for these lot, the party had hardly started at 2 or 3. They wanted to keep going till like 10 the next day. And of course, with this drug usage, the police were now sniffing around, and also so were criminal gangs. They started to take charge of selling the drugs, and all of a sudden, this small legal scene started to realize that the clubs had limitations. As I mentioned in my skinhead video, the National Front were kind of radicalizing lots of young skinheads in this era. And so there was a lot of racial tension in this era, particularly towards black people. They would often find themselves not really welcome into pubs and clubs. But, black guys have got a party too. And so the black community in England would start to do these things called sound system parties, where they would have to go to like some shitty community hall. After clearing up the five-a-side football pitch, they would turn it into a club, bringing their own sound systems, their own DJs, and their own music. And if we look at this footage from 1986, which is before most people believe that house music came to the UK, we can see these communities dancing to house. So there was this going on with the black community, and then you had the new age traveler community. And they would do a thing that was a continuation from the 70s called free parties, where basically a bunch of hippies would meet up at Stonehenge to pray at the sun.
Just trying to live our lives, that's all.
We don't interfere with anyone else.
And this world's supposed to be a common treasury for everybody to share, not people to
free
button
land.
up.
So if we take all of these things, plus the political unrest, plus the Ibiza4 coming back to the UK and presenting house music and ecstasy to the white youth culture, all of this combined with one very important heatwave led us to... what were being dubbed as acid house parties had started to leave the city centres and head for just random warehouses, air hangars and disused buildings where they didn't have any rules and they could party for days straight if it needed, and it often needed. And literally you would have tens of thousands of young people who would find out about these raves on just random flyers in the city. The organisation of this was ridiculous. Like, there was no address on the flyer. Thousands of kids would just meet at local service stations and go to a public payphone, ring the number on the day of the festival, and then be told a location by some shady geezer on the other end of the line. They had to do all this, obviously, to avoid being shut down by the police. But they were always happening sort of outside of city centres in random pockets. And it was funny because this was largely in part thanks to a road called the M25, a ring road around London that ironically was opened by none other than Margaret Thatcher. Very quickly, in the late 80s to the early 90s, rave culture completely spread all across the UK. And it's so interesting seeing just how much of an impact in such a short time it had on the youth culture of the time. I really highly recommend you check out Jeremy Deller talk about this topic. I've linked it in the description, where you can just see how different the culture of clubbing was in 1988 compared to 1992.
And this is her.
And this is the course of now in the Blackpool.
Yes, we're back in Blackpool.
Hello, welcome to Hitman and Her. You might have noticed this isn't a normal Hitman and Her. We're not at a normal Roxy or a Ritzy or anything. We're actually at a rave.
And the thing that made it really unique was that there was like a mix of different subcultures, like Manchester. This was where you had indie rock bands who would play sometimes at the same venues as house artists. For instance, you'd have a band like Happy Mondays and then you'd have 808 State. They were both embracing elements of rave culture. Happy Mondays literally had just a full-time dancer called Bez. And he was just a guy on Gurners just sending it. As well, the combination of different subcultures created a dress sense, like a fashion, which some people called baggy. It was like a sort of mixture of tie-dye, psychedelic, hippie type styles combined with football casual style.
I remember a lot of the West Ham lads would come up to me on a Saturday football, you know. What's happening to all our leaders? What's all this rave music, you know? We gone soft, or we fighting, or we raving.
It was hilarious. I mean, so many of the football boys out there lightened up an incredible amount.
You used to have football hooligans, you know, being really friendly, because the ecstasy hit the football supporters as well, which changed their whole mentality.
But that was the point of rave culture. It was bringing all these different pockets. At one rave, you might see a Jamaican rude boy partying with a National Front skinhead, and then you'd have some suburban white kids, some punks, all under one roof. And this, to be honest, is where ecstasy plays its role.
Well, I think one of the key things about ecstasy is it was very difficult to drink alcohol once you'd had a pill, because you got dehydrated, so you drank water. So there was no one getting drunk. There was no one getting aggressive. So that was what it wasn't. And what it did do was it gave you a whole sense of openness and of love.
And the fact that this sort of environment was so, like, spiritual in a way. Repetitive beats, putting people into these trances, the loved up feeling of the drug, and like a coming together feeling had a profound effect on the ethos and the culture of raving.
Feeling great, feeling wonderful. Best I felt really, tell the truth, for a long while.
In a time of deep social tension, disharmony, and isolation, these different groups of people, different races, different social classes, they were showing that all these differences could be put aside if you just have some 303 Ronin bass lines, some 4 to the floor thudders, and a little bit of ecstasy. However, this summer of love couldn't last forever. This brings us onto a recurring segment on the Jimmy the Giant Show, and that is the moral panic. As always, polite society saw young people having fun and said, no, we can't have that. So suddenly the media decided that, mass unemployment, social tensions, they didn't matter anymore. The true blight on society was young kids dancing and having fun. Endless headlines about acid parties popped up, where they would make up stories like pigeons having their heads eaten, or thousands of ecstasy wrappers on the floor that turned out to be confetti. And after a very few ecstasy-related deaths, like 4 scale, The Guardian said there was 2 in 1988, and The Independent has it that there was 14 by 1993. So of course that would warrant the media, the politicians and polite society going into complete meltdown.
More acid house parties means more aggravation for local communities, more risk of a major accident to those attending.
These endless articles did 2 things to British society. If you were like 35 years old and above, it put the fear of God in you. The world was falling apart and the children were all going to go to hell. But anyone kind of under that age, it was effectively as if these newspapers were running adverts for people to come to the raves. This fairly underground scene was now everywhere, and all of the youth culture wanted a piece of the action. And so, from the late 80s to the early 90s, rave culture was in its heyday.
836 youngsters were arrested and lined up outside the disused warehouse, which had been broken into. From there, they were ferried to nearby police stations. Youngsters who returned to the scene said they'd been attacked by the police.
Eventually they got through and just ran right with the truncheons, hitting anybody they could in sight.
Police were now being mobilised to try and clamp down on these raves. And it became like this game of cat and mouse, where the rave organisers had to get clever, find new ways to get around the police.
Actually sent 2 decoy lorries out 2 hours in advance of the actual real sound systems in completely the wrong direction to where the party was happening, and it worked. They were followed by the police.
Others bring in lawyers to raves to let people know their rights, so that the police couldn't intimidate them out of going. The raves became more elaborate, bigger sound systems, even different things you could do. If you wanted to jump on a bouncy castle and eat a hot dog, you could do that now at these illegal raves. But you have to be completely fair to like the general public, and the raves were a nuisance.
Can't have that. That's not allowed. It shouldn't be allowed. They should get the army or something, police or whatever, get in there and split them up.
If you lived in some sleepy old British village, like a nice quaint town, and you wake up to go feed your chickens, and all of a sudden Ibifas arrive down the road, you would be pretty pissed off. I get it. And as well, the illegal nature of the drugs being used did attract criminals, and obviously that would bring its own problems. And that brought the police. And eventually there was one event at Castlemore Common in 1992 where 20 to 40,000 people attended, most of who were these new age travelers who had now got an affinity for techno music. And this event would really be the turning point.
The police came down on them like a ton of bricks, and that was sort of the end. That was the start of the criminal justice bill, really, wasn't it?
The bill was wide-ranging and designed to criminalise squatters and travellers, ravers and protesters.
This new bill was very weirdly and specifically worded to give police powers to remove people who were preparing a rave. They actually described the music used as a succession of repetitive beats. Prior to this, if a rave was organised on private land, if Bazza slid a few notes in the pocket of a farmer and said, "Can we have a party?" what could the police do? It was all above board. But these new powers let the police shut down raves before they could even begin. Of course, this was seen as a massive suppression of human rights, freedom of expression, your right to assembly, but this is Britain, so obviously none of that matters. However, despite all this, it was too late. The genie was out the bowl, and as we know today, raving, of course, never died. From here, all that happened was that raving became mainstream. Electronic music became really popular and the songs started to chart.
Black Box went to #1 for 6 weeks without getting played on radio once, and all because it was being played at the raves that summer.
And now licenses were being given out to legal venues to stay open all night. And these events were much safer. You'd have big old fucking Terry at the door. They would have to have bouncers. The buildings were held up to a higher standard, so they were safer. They were soundproof, they needed certain licenses, etc. And as good as that is, and it is good, there is a problem, and that is that requires money. And if you're educated at Eton and you worked in a few banks across London and your name was James Palumbo, then sick, you can open Ministry of Sound. But if Bazza and the boys want to go set up a little jungleist massive, you know, in a dodgy air hangar in Shittham, then, you know, unlucky boys. Off you go back to working at Tesco's. This was kind of like bittersweet in a way because, you know, there was mainstream adoption. Finally, it had been accepted and legitimized as a real music genre, a real culture. But the original, very democratic, grassroots, do-it-yourself kind of vibe was gone. It was kind of taken out of their hands and put into the hands of people who were much better connected and could afford to put on these events legally. By the mid to late 90s, the golden era of rave culture was past. This coming together in such a socially divided time, it was amazing. That is a great thing that happened. And as well, the change to music is monumental. Since the 90s, electronic music has really stayed incredibly popular. And the way that it continues to evolve and change, like with dubstep, drum and bass, etc. And now, even the Americans like electronic music. Obviously, they had to rebrand it to EDM, you know, just to make it a little bit easier. The dance music industry is worth about $11.3 billion, and I don't need to tell you about all the amazing raves and all the big festivals that happen now. It's just part of the mainstream culture. But with all that said, it does leave one last important question. There's a cult classic film called Human Traffic. Every raver has watched it and it deals with this topic incredibly well. My favorite scene is this one, where you see Danny Dyer talking to some geezer passionately. They're strangers, they don't know each other, but they're talking like they're best friends.
That's what I was going to say, the fucking hooves, mate. What calm down. What about the Emperor, yeah? The fucking Emperor. The king crackhead of the galaxy, yeah? He's got so much fucking hard cash from selling crack to space junkies, yeah?
But then it shows the come down and the morning after.
And R2-D2, when he's... Remember that? You know what? Fuck it.
The children of ecstasy aren't safe anymore. We're no longer all together as one, but separate mental patients that yearn to be ejected out of this poisoned atmosphere to a warm bed and friendly therapist.
The Summer of Love ravers really, truly believed that they were going to change the world. And in many ways they did. There was definitely some improvement in like racial and social tensions post the 90s. Music, fashion, culture, everything has changed. However, when we look today and see just how divided society is right now, it seems as though the second Summer of Love has kind of worn off a little bit. And it almost feels as if societally we're in a very similar climate that created the conditions that birthed the 90s rave culture. So a part of me kind of believes that this is cyclical and maybe we'll see some kind of coming together unity type movement. But you know, until that happens, all I'm gonna say is,
what's your name? What have you had? Reach for the lasers. Safe as fuck.
Oh, and also don't forget to click the link in the description to get a special discount of CyberGhost VPN, so you can protect your data while you browse the internet and get full access to all the blocked content around the world on the internet for $2.03 a month only. Totally risk-free. Check it out, link in the description.